Lecture 12, the 30th of June 1959. Schematism. The meaning of our deliberations last time was to show you just how far Kant has taken the idea of the subjective mediation of all knowledge, and how radically the idea of the subjectivity of the objective has progressed. The essence of our conclusions was this: the distinction between form and matter, and thus between subjective and objective elements, constitutes the dualism that is so unambiguously inscribed in the topography of Kantian philosophy. But this dualism is largely qualified and eliminated in the dynamics of his thought, if I may use this notion to contrast with that of topography or geography. We might say that, contrary to his own intention or his own argument, the concept of the given is cancelled out to all intents and purposes. It is undeniable that this creates a number of grave problems for the critique of pure reason. I have already mentioned one such problem. This is that, as the argument of the critique of pure reason develops, it turns out that what remains of everything independent of the subject or that comes to the subject from outside is at bottom completely null and void. This means that the distinction made in the critique of pure reason between appearances and things in themselves is not to be taken all that seriously, because the things in themselves remain no more than a noble feature, as Brecht phrases it in the Threepenny Opera. 1. In other words, they survive as a reminder that subjective knowledge is not the whole story, but they are without further consequence themselves. This difficulty is compounded by a further one that I drew your attention to at the start of these lectures, if my memory serves me right. 2. This is that the concept of knowledge itself becomes problematic. This occurs because not just the forms, but with the radicalization of the concept that form, the quintessence of what is known, is incorporated into the subject. We might well inquire what it means to know something if that something is completely indeterminate, and if knowledge is no more than the quintessence of subjectivity, taking this expression in a fairly strong sense. This contradiction survives the translation of objectivity into subjectivity and is not explicitly addressed by Kant. Perhaps the good old things in themselves provided him with a sufficient consolation. It may have fulfilled the function of the other that knowledge ultimately refers to. The only trouble is that this consolation is of the kind we generally feel at funerals. That is to say, we assert that all our knowledge ultimately refers to the thing in itself, since the appearances that I constitute, that I organize, are ultimately caused by the thing in itself. But since the process of cognition and its content are radically separated from this absolutely unknowable things in themselves by a xwpwij, a rupture, in the Platonic sense, the idea of a thing in itself adds nothing to my actual knowledge. This means that what I recognize as an object is just that, an object in the sense that we have discussed at length. It is not a thing in itself, and always remains something constituted by a subject. Thus the problem of knowledge as a single tautology survives intact. To oversimplify grossly, it is the problem that at bottom the subject can only know itself. 3. I told you that this difficulty in the critique of pure reason is not explicitly addressed, and that the failure to do this is undoubtedly connected with the duplication of the concept of the thing which we have already discussed. But it would be a vast underestimation of the power of Kant's thought, as it so often is when you think you have caught Kant out in some inconsistency or her, to imagine that the difficulty of which I have just told you had not surfaced in concrete form in the course of Kant's arguments. I told you, earlier on, for a first rough orientation the structure of the critique of pure reason should be thought of in terms of various materials falling into a machine where they are then processed, and that what then emerges as the result of this processing is my knowledge. In reality, this result amounts to an arrangement of these materials, in the broadest sense, a kind of conceptual organization, in actual fact no more than a grid, in part also an abbreviated version of the given world, and something that is external to, and has nothing in common with, what there is to be known. It was not for nothing that I advised you then that you should hold fast to this idea in order to obtain a rough and ready view of the architecture of the critique of pure reason. And you would do well even now to keep in your mind this rather crude distinction that amounts to the distinction between form and content. Nevertheless, to be fair to Kant, you need to see that this is not the end of the story. The fact is that the critique of pure reason also contains a completely different line of thought. This is the idea that, if knowledge is to be truly authoritative, it must adapt itself to its own material. The kind of externality characteristic of a purely classificatory type of thinking, I am speaking here of externality without any derogatory connotations, is much like the externality of the natural sciences, which have become accustomed to liberate themselves from the so-called internal nature of things that dominated the natural sciences in Bacon's day, and have concentrated instead on describing the phenomena they observe with the aid of external concepts. So please do not misunderstand me here. When I speak of externality, I am not appealing to the facile arrogance of the German tradition of inwardness. In Kant it is an element that has on its side the entire emotional force of the history of the modern natural sciences, with all its triumphs. All this is by the way. However, as an epistemologist, Kant did not rest content with this externality. He faced up to the problem of how, in this interplay of matter and form, that is, in the immanent presence of the knowing consciousness, matter and form could possibly have anything to do with one another. In other words, he had to confront the question of how knowledge might be able to adapt itself to what it knows. And in this problem what survives within the sphere of the immanent consciousness that Kant has marked out is, after all, the idea of synthesis, the non-tautological, that is, the idea that knowledge must know more than itself. It must do more than simply reflect the form of knowledge in general. This curious problem makes its appearance in one of the most difficult chapters of the Critique of Pure Reason. I shall not give you an account of its contents now. I hope to have time to do this later. 5 Instead, I want to put you in a position where you can understand the function of this especially difficult and obscure chapter, where you can understand what the point of it is, something that does not generally become clear in the usual commentaries. For if matters were really so simple, if it were simply the case that the material turned up and were then enveloped as if in a cocoon, then Kant would have had no need to reflect on the way in which these different elements were mediated. But in fact he did reflect on them. The expression of these thoughts, that is, the expression of the question of how form and matter actually come together, forms the subject matter of the chapter on the schematism of pure reason. 6 At this point you must think of the schematism problem as the question of how it is possible for knowledge to be not just something alien to its object, but also the truth because it adapts itself to the nature of what it is classifying, the nature of what is immediately given. In other words, We are talking about the connection between the two main branches of knowledge I have told you about, to wit, receptivity and spontaneity. How can I ascertain that these two things are linked? The question is not, when I think about something I have perceived, when I conceptualize it, do I organize it and subsume it under concepts in a manner external to my percept? The question is rather, how is it possible for the concepts I use to fit the thing they are describing? This question is of course as old as philosophy itself, and was first formulated as early as Plato's doctrine of the proper division of concepts. What he called for was an arrangement in which concepts were not just ordered in a logical system, as we would say today, were not just part of a system of classification, but were arranged in such a way that they corresponded to the nature of the thing being classified. As Plato put it, they should naturally fit the nature of the things described. 7. The question we are concerned with here, and that forced itself on Kant's attention in the schematism chapter, is the question of a discrepancy between a category and its object. He tried to resolve it by arguing that there was a kind of intermediate stage between intuition and concept, a kind of model or image. These models were models of what we are perceiving and enable us to recognize what we perceive. Now, I do not wish at present to go into the question of what these images are, these schemata that he traces back to an art concealed in the depths of the human soul. It amounts to an aporetic concept that signals the presence of a perplexity, a difficulty. 9. Instead, I would like at least to convey to you some of Kant's thoughts on the subject and explain how they lead him to this problem, that is, to the problem of how within the space defined entirely by the subject, the non-subjective, the given, somehow contrives to make itself felt. For example, Kant says, in all subsumptions of an object under a concept, the representation of the object must be homogeneous with the concept. In other words, the concept must contain something which is represented in the object that is to be subsumed under it. 10. Please take note of this. The concept must contain something that is represented in the object. This means that the concept must in some way be influenced by the material be perceived. The concept may not shape it. It may not deal with it arbitrarily, but it must be so constituted that it somehow corresponds to it. Or, in the language used in classical philosophy to discuss these matters, the concept must resemble its object in a certain sense. 11. This requirement that there should be homogeneity, that is, a resemblance between object and concept, implies that Kant is aware that the separation between these two sources of receptivity and spontaneity is somehow arbitrary. You can explain this quite simply to yourselves when you realize that for Kant an immediate given, that is, what you appear simply to receive from outside, contains not just the forms of intuition, but also thought in a certain sense, namely, synthesis, the union of disparate elements into a definite intuition. Conversely, if a concept is to be true and not just something arbitrary, it must necessarily be influenced by the nature of the object to which it refers. Thanks to the total separation of spontaneity and receptivity in the architecture of the work, this element of a relation between these two pillars of knowledge, as Kant calls them, is utterly lost sight of, whereupon Kant then tries to retrieve it. Thus the empirical concept of a plate is homogeneous with the pure geometrical concept of a circle. The roundness which is thought in the latter can be intuited in the former. This sentence is not without its difficulties, since it is not entirely clear what is meant by thinking roundness, if roundness is not simultaneously intuited. To think roundness means that you can give the equation for a circle in terms of analytical geometry, that is, as the geometrical location of all points that are equidistant from a given fixed point, namely, the midpoint. But in such an equation the concept or the representation of roundness is simply not present. Kant leaves the question open for empirical concepts, but insists on it all the more emphatically for the categories, that is, for the highest and most universal concepts. For these concepts, you will recollect, are supposed to have been purified of everything intuitive. It is thanks to this purity, to this freedom from elements that can be intuited, that they can be said to be constitutive, that is, they are made possible by virtue of synthetic a priori judgments, and can deliver knowledge that is absolutely necessary. In consequence, it is now absolutely impossible, as Kant is quick to point out, to backtrack on this and suddenly to ascribe sensory qualities to them. In other words, they bear absolutely no resemblance to whatever is subsumed under them. But if that is the case, and Kant is quite frank about this even though it goes against his own interest, or the interest of his system, if the concepts of the understanding are really free of intuited qualities, and if the intuitions are quite free of concepts, and this freedom from concepts of even the purest intuitions is something he demonstrated with great ingenuity in the Transcendental Aesthetic, 13, then we have every right to inquire how the two can ever come together. That is to say, how are we to conceive of a situation in which there is knowledge that conforms to its object, that conforms via the concept to what is given, doing justice to the given instead of simply dictating to it brutally? This is actually the lowest point of the argument, since here, despite all the subjective mediation, in fact through all the subjective mediation, whatever is not proper to the subject contrives after all to make its presence felt in the critique of pure reason. It is in this spirit that you should understand the entire thrust of the Schematism chapter, which incidentally regards time as the test case of the unification of intuition and concept. Before discussing that, however, I would like to read you the passage in Kant that comes closest to showing Kant's own awareness of this problem, but pure concepts of understanding being quite heterogeneous from empirical intuitions can never be met with any intuition. For no one will say that a category, such as that of causality, can be intuited through sense and is itself contained in appearance. How, then, is the subsumption of intuitions under pure concepts, the application of a category to appearances, possible? A transcendental doctrine of judgment is necessary just because of this natural and important question. We must be able to show how pure concepts can be applicable to appearances. 14 Please note, they would be readily applicable if it were only a matter of creating an order. We might then object that this application is arbitrary, because there would be no fundamentum in re, if I may use a not entirely suitable expression from earlier philosophy. That is to say, the concepts would contain nothing that corresponds to something in the matter in hand. Kant's reply to this, aside from those models or images, is that time is the factor that organizes or schematizes the givens in our experience, that schematizes our understanding with respect to appearances and their form. The reason for this is that time is the factor that is common to both thought and intuition. This means, on the one hand, that time is a form of intuition in the sense that our own experiences are given to us in the form of a one-dimensional continuum of past, present and future, independently of all our thinking. On the other hand, Our thinking, as a synthesizing process, is only conceivable as something that is enacted in time and related to time. Time is inherent in thought and constitutive of its nature, namely of the course that it runs. In Kant's eyes, the fact that time is the common element is the key to our ability to subsume appearances under the concepts of the understanding without, we should add, committing a theta 3L5, L5, A OYV05. That is to say, without mixing our categories, without adding oranges and typewriters, something we would otherwise be unable to avoid. This, then, is the point I wish to bring to your attention, the point at which Kant attempted to solve the problem of intuition and category, and with it the problem of how the non-identical, that is, the non-subjective element within subjectivity, can make itself felt. And if we are justified in talking of Kant's profundity, we may say that the really profound passages in Kant are those where he keeps on probing, where he refuses to be satisfied with generalities, where he is not the Kant about whom you are asked in examinations. His profundity is to be found, and this is true of every great thinker, not just of Kant, in the way he follows where the argument leads, without regard to any preconceived goal. He may be said to externalize himself, to surrender to the demands of the matter in hand, and to think against his own inclinations. The greatness or importance of a philosophy may in fact be measured by its ability to do this. And the immeasurable quality of Kant's philosophy seems to me to be situated at this very point. The fact that we can learn from the no-dual points in his thought where this happens appears to me to justify the claim that in Kant we have a thinker who is far from being a mere historical monument. However, I should not like to deviate here from the task I have set myself. This was to inquire into the motivating experience that underlies this universal subjective mediation in Kant. I would point to two factors here. Firstly, it represents the reflection in philosophy of the experience of the natural sciences. The emergence of the natural sciences made possible an unprecedented expansion of knowledge through experimentation, classification, and subjective intervention. This knowledge has as its only criterion the fact that it works, and that it does so because it renounces any attempt to make any statement about the nature of things, and about what things really are. It is no great exaggeration if I say that the natural sciences combine a peculiarly defeatist attitude towards the declared goal of their inquiry with the triumphalist attitude towards what they are able to discover once they have abandoned the attempt to discover anything. This situation in the sciences, one which is not changed to this day, is one you will find reflected in Kamian philosophy. For its claim to objectivity reflects the triumphalism of science about its success in having taken its domination of nature to the point where an infinite world of givens has been subjugated by the human subject, that is, it has been shown to be of the same nature as the subject. However, this is only possible if you renounce a persistent prejudice, namely, the insight into the essential nature of the given world. In a sense, it could almost be said that the subjectivization of the concept of knowledge in Kant is the corollary of the real history of the natural sciences. For the sciences can be said to have achieved a real dominance over the world only when they renounced the attempt to gain knowledge of anything apart from what is accessible to human organization and human shaping. This is what enabled them to find their way around the world of human beings, and to subject an ever greater proportion of given things and events to control by human beings. You may say then that the twofold process of resignation and the growth in productive energy are what constitutes the nature of the modern natural sciences in general, and that this process comes to a knowledge of itself in Kantian philosophy. This is as much as to say that the world of experiment is actually the positive world of the critique of pure reason, and that the Aristotelian world of forms that the sciences have shaken off is the world that has received the coup de grace at the hands of philosophical reflection after having long since been dismissed by the natural sciences. Henceforth that world of forms was to be excluded from the world of science proper. However, in my judgment this does not exhaust the potential of Kantian subjectivism. To understand this you need to reflect further on Kant's practical philosophy. In addition to the factor we have just been talking about, the reflection in philosophy of the historical advance of the natural sciences, there is also the idea of freedom or the idea of maturity. As we have seen, the Kantian theory of cognition proclaims that the world in its objectivity is actually the product of my subjectivity. This means that the world is not just something that has to be accepted passively, and obeyed, but that it is something that can be mastered by me. In other words, human beings are the subjects of their world and not just the objects. Kant's critique of reason would not be conceivable in the absence of this idea of the social and political emancipation of the human subject that has ceased to act out a submissive role towards the world and instead has discovered in the freedom and autonomy of the subject the principle which alone enables the world to be known. That is to say, with the discovery of its own autonomy the subject identifies the principle of the world as such. For many years it has been customary to ridicule idealism and treat it as a dead duck. This trend had its roots in the writings which marked Schiller's conversion to a materialist phenomenology. Since then there has been no end to the condemnations of idealism as an anachronism. I am certain that no protestations will be needed to persuade you that I am mindful of this critique of idealism. Indeed, I believe I have even made some pretty authoritative contributions towards it. But I also think that we should not take it too much for granted since, now that the untruth of idealism has been recognized and demonstrated over and over again, we ought also to reconsider the untruth of idealism in the spirit of dialectics and thus to perceive it as a particular truth. This means that while we must bluntly state that this Kantian subjectivism cannot be sustained in its pure form, we should nevertheless acknowledge that it proclaims crucial experiences. One of these is that of the dual relation of the natural sciences to their object which they simultaneously dominate and retreat from. Or again, there is the idea of freedom whose potential it proclaims. I would almost be willing to say that idealism may be false when understood as an abstract system, as a scheme of knowledge that asserts itself once and for all. But I would insist that it is undoubtedly true as the index of a specific state of the self-consciousness of spirit and at the same time as a mediated stage in the history of thought, that is to say, one that does not naively oppose itself to reality, a type of thought that had no precedent. I should certainly like to underline the fact that no philosophy which does not possess these mediations can claim to have moved beyond Kantianism and idealism. This remains true regardless of whether philosophies that imagine they have been cured of idealism call themselves an ontology or dialectical materialism. Rather, all such philosophies regress to a more primitive stage. To echo Feuerbach's saying, the challenge is not to be against idealism, but to rise above it. 15. This means that the themes of idealism should be integrated into theory, but without their being given the status of absolutes. On the other hand, when we consider these experiences, we realize that the claims of idealism cannot be sustained and that they lead to conceptual difficulties at every turn. We must therefore ask ourselves how that can be possible. How can a consciousness that, as I have tried to show, has so much about it that is right nevertheless end up being wrong? My answer would be that there is a sense in which the Kantian theory of cognition anticipates a specific goal and does so in a mistaken fashion. Kant explicitly defined the ideas of freedom and autonomy as postulates, as regulative ideas, and did not include them among the constituents of knowledge. On the other hand, it is obvious, and is implied in the structure of the Critique of Pure Reason, that they impinge on the Kantian system at every turn. Thus they cannot be disentangled from these issues. What this means is that there is a sense in which Kantian philosophy strives to define the world as it ought to be, much as was once said in a classical R61 row that Sophocles depicted people as they ought to be while Euripides showed them as they really are. 16. We might well say that the element of ideology in Kant's philosophy can be pinpointed in the idea that as an object of knowledge the world appears as a human world, as our world, on a plane where that is not actually true. Precisely because it is not true, we might say, because we are still heteronymous, because we live in unfreedom, the Critique of Pure Reason presents us with a highly dubious mirror image, a kind of complementary ideology. By that I mean that the world upon which we may be said to depend appears to us, by virtue of a mechanism I cannot discuss in detail now, as if we were its masters. If in truth we are captives in this world, blindly dependent upon it and largely incapable of doing anything about it, this is reflected in theoretical philosophy as if we were the captives of our own selves. From this vantage point you can understand the comments I made at the outset about the element of tautology in Kantian philosophy. For this tautology is nothing other than the expression of captivity. As knowing subjects we know only ourselves. In this sense we are never able to get outside ourselves. We are imprisoned within ourselves. This, too, has its profound truth in Kantian philosophy, because it means that the world in which we are captive is in fact a self-made world. It is the world of exchange, the world of commodities, the world of reified human relations that confront us, presenting us with a facade of objectivity, a second nature. This likewise is conveyed by that curiously tautological conception of the Critique of Pure Reason, but it is not given its proper name. For it to be given its true name, this philosophy would have to cease being what it essentially is, an idealist philosophy. The world is all the more alien to us, we might say, the more it crowds in on us. This relationship that we register daily in our own bodies is similarly registered in the dualism and idealism of Kant's philosophy. It is my belief that it is only when you perceive this idealism and all its implications and ramifications that you will be able to avoid the idiotic choice of either embracing a philosophy that is unacceptable in this form or else of seizing the opportunity to gloat over its defects. What you must do instead is appreciate its truth content as one that contains its own untruth. Lecture 13, the 2nd of July 1959. Constituents and